We've all seen social movements. We've all lived in neighborhoods. Uh, we've all clocked in, and we've seen successful organizing. We've seen disappointing organizing. We've seen failed organizing. And I think as we talk, we'll realize that almost everybody here has already knows something about this. Some a lot, and some a little, but that's okay. I'm trained in the tradition of popular education, which is highly participatory and draws from the experiences of folks, which is a lot harder to do on Zoom. So I'm just going to say that in advance. This will be much more lecture than I'm used to, but please bring the questions, bring the dialogue, and we're going to make it happen. Um, and finally, when we talk about organizing, I think just one thing to preface is that there's many models of organizing and many different ideas and values and ideology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics and show you one example from history about how one group, a group of groups, a coalition, did it. People that I'm very familiar with and are many of them are dear friends and comrades of mine. But let's just remember that organizing's a bucket with, that many, or stone soup, maybe, for those of you who are familiar with this. There's faith-based organizing, there's feminist informed organizing, there's domestic organizing that is informed by decolonial struggles elsewhere. There's abolitionist organizing. So we take what works and leave what doesn't. But I just want to, I think that any time that somebody gets up and says this is only the one way to organize, they've already failed as a teacher. So let's jump in right there. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Right. Good for that. And also, I'll also go ahead and say that there's going to be some things that don't make sense at first. So I'm going to draw this talk from the history of the original Rainbow Coalition between the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Illinois, the Young Patriots Organization, and the Puerto Rican Young Lords. Can everybody see this picture okay? Not? Great. So this is a picture of that was taken in Oakland, California at the United Front Against Fascism conference in 1969. It was called by the Black Panther Party to bring people together against what they viewed was the advent of fascism in the United States. Certainly, when you go Panthers through a time, the idea that fascism was a distinct possibility was certainly something very, very understandable. But I'd like people to look at this look at this picture here. What if people were to walk into an leftist space with with a Confederate flag on their uniform? We would not assume that they were walking in allyship with the Black Panther Party, but that's exactly what happened here. And we're going to talk a little bit about how those alliances got built, how the understanding got built, and how the Patriots eventually dropped the Confederate flag. Okay. So this is one healthy definition of community organizing. It's not the only one. If anybody Googles community organizing definition, you are going to get 1,001 definitions, and most of them have something that's very useful in it. But the definition that I like, this has been collectively developed through my classes of listening to organizers with young and old talk about what's important to them. Community organizing is a process building power in communities who are often left out of formal decision-making processes. Organizers work towards small changes that contribute to a larger project of social justice. This is done by developing the skills, analysis, and participation of everyday people. Transformative organizing challenges systems of oppression and builds solidarity between exploited and oppressed people. So there's a lot in a few sentences. I'm calling out that power is important, right? Because and power is not a bad word. It's how we use power that defines it. Power with, power over. Ethically, y'all are humanists, so we all value ethics, ethically guided power. We work towards small changes, but we don't just stop there, right? We may be challenging the way that racism or classism or homophobia shows up in a small way, but we're doing it in a way that helps bring people over to the larger process of getting rid of these things, and developing a boldness in the people that we, and the skills that it takes. So participation isn't just one or two savvy leaders, but it can be for all of us. And finally, and this differentiates from other modes of organizing, is that it challenges the system of oppression. It's not just about getting one law passed. It's about making sure that the engines of oppression have less power at the end of the day. So they'll stop causing oppression and exploitation. Okay. So these are two very different quotes. If everybody could take a look at them, and if this is my class, I'd have people read this out. But if we were in real time, very famous quote from Margaret Mead, the wonderful Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, that's the only thing that ever has." There's some truth to that, but I think it stands in contrast to one of my heroes, the great Ella Baker, one of the architects of the civil rights movement. I've always thought that what is needed is the development of people who are interested in not being leaders as much as in developing leadership in others. So this maxim reflects in a lot of things we hear today as we debate about how things move forward. Are we leaderless? Are we leaderful? Or is power just concentrated in a few people that believe that they have the correct line on everything? And I think Ella Baker's legacy, I really encourage people to read a lot about her, especially the Barbara Ransby biography, because it really talks about what leaderful movements and organizing looks like, where we're making places for many people to have initiative, maybe different specializations, things like that. Not, certainly not structureless, because that's horrible. That's everything goes. But having having organizations where many people can develop their leadership at different times. So where does organizing happen? I like to think about these are the factories of social justice, or as Fred Hampton liked to say, there's power wherever there's people. The community or neighborhood, our workplaces, the church, and the campus. These are traditionally, and certainly we see the advent of online organizing happening. And I'd like to share this story about one time I was teaching a class on how to do outreach in an organizing context, how to do face-to-face stuff. And I went on this long tangent about, if you were doing many people make the mistake that online outreach and online organizing it's not organizing, it's just a tool, blah, blah, blah. I was on a self-righteous little thing, rant about it, because I do still believe that face-to-face community outreach is wonderful and is foundational to what we do. Learning how to listen to people, learning how to take our form demands out of what we're hearing. I think we talk about our movements debate violence versus nonviolence, but I think that some of our most potent weapons are a pen and a clipboard and our ability to listen to our neighbors. So anyhow, I get home from teaching, pour myself a whiskey, And I get a text from a good friend saying, I think we just launched something a lot bigger than we thought it was. And it was my good friend Alicia Garza talking about the online organizing that they had initiated through Black Lives Matter. So that's another thing about organizing, is always be willing to revise and be open to new ideas, right? Because those new ideas are coming. We're going to see a lot of wonderful innovations in organizing over the next few years. By every generation of youth that have taken up the mantle of social change will always change something from the generations before. I'm in that middle generation. I wasn't part of the New Left. I was only born in 1970, but the modifications that my generation made to the old Alinskyite models and the peace movement models and things like that, well, they're going to get all challenged by the next generation, the next generation out of that, and that's fine. Okay. So our story starts in Chicago in 1964 in the Uptown neighborhood. The Uptown neighborhood in Chicago wasn't only white, but it was largely white, and not only white, but it was filled with folks moving up from the South looking for work, and what in some vernacular would be called hillbillies or rednecks. And at that point, many parts of Uptown became very culturally appropriate to this group of immigrants. The pool halls, the barbecue pits, the honky tonk bars, the country western, and they faced quite a bit of police brutality, horrible slum-like housing, and lots of prejudice. The city's toughest integration problem, it says in this Harper's Magazine article, has nothing to do with Negroes. It involves a small army of white Protestant early American migrants from the South who are usually proud, poor, primitive, and fast with a knife. If that long run-on sentence has so much class contempt in it, you could practically write a dissertation just on that sentence, and the fact that these type of stereotypes existed even for white people, very poor white people. Okay. So during this time, there was some students, as part of Students for Democratic Society. A group of them, not all of them, of course, were thinking of trying to figure out ways to apply what their Black and brown comrades were asking them to do, which is to organize their own, is to go into white communities and organize for justice, because many of these students that were involved with SDS were also part of Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had done much very valiant and brave work in the South, but their Black and brown allies were saying, you know what, you can come into our neighborhood and organize down here, but we can't just walk into a white neighborhood and start knocking on doors. And that's where racism and white supremacy is brewing up in reaction. We need to redeploy you, right? We need to ask you to go into your own communities. So one group of students went into Uptown and formed the Jobs or Income Now community union to work with poor and working class white people, around campaigns that talk to their economic needs, but also were ones that could unite them with communities of color. And keep in mind, Chicago at this time, politics were, it might have been at the top of the North, but it could have been the deep South as far as the segregation and oppression going on. What they also found, these young SDS members found that many people in these communities already had some experience with social justice organizing through Black Lung organizing, through labor organizing, and some had actually, like the great Peggy Tracy, and part of the Congress of Racial Equality. So their presence and the development of Join really just helped bring people together, helped amplify the voices of people in the community that were already ready to break with racism, and provided a really nice, a really nice way of organizing and building some infrastructure. Um, so what they did that was very very, very interesting, and I think really actually rather brilliant at the time, was that they go out and organize wherever there was injustice. They tried to pick landlords who had holdings in black neighborhoods, brown neighborhoods, and white neighborhoods, so people could have could have a chance of working with one another, walking on the same picket lines, because that can be really transformative, right, for people who are ready to ask questions about how change is made. Even the chance to get to know someone that you may have known about, and understanding that you had real enemies and in the world, not each other, was pretty was powerful in and of itself. That's another thing that I think about organizing, is that we think sometimes we get very mathematical about our victories. Certainly, I'm very proud of helping to organize Free City, so thousands of San Franciscans could go to City College for free. Wonderful. But it's also about the way that we did it, of bringing together people, color lines, class lines, from class to gender lines, and those small transformations are victories in and of themselves. So one thing that was very shocking to many of the communities of color was to realize that in Uptown, police brutality was a gigantic thing, just like it was in the South Side. Um, and you see over here in the left-hand corner, anti-police brutality demonstration led by poor white people. And you see just like in San Francisco and Oakland during this time, the specter of urban renewal, or removal, as it should be correctly called, was hitting all poor neighborhoods. And we also are reminded that even though jobs or income now was very centered uh, on developing the anti-racist leadership of poor white people, that people like Dovey Coleman, who we see here, who later went on to organize in the welfare rights organizing, were also very present. So Peggy Terry, just a little bit about her. Somebody should write an entire book about. I only wrote a little bit about her, but not enough in our book, Hillbilly Nationalist. Peggy Terry was somebody who was 2 generations into the Ku Klux Klan. And when she saw Martin Luther King being released by the police in Montgomery, only to be beaten by a white vigilante mob, something clicked, and she committed herself towards racism, both in herself, her family, and in the body politic of the United States. You can see that she was taken very seriously by her comrades of color. I believe, I don't know this for sure, but I believe that she was the only white woman to ever be asked to be on the cover of Jet magazine. She also went on to lead Ed Mark King's innovation, the contingent in the Poor People's March in Resurrection City, and she ran for vice president with Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver and Peggy Terry couldn't stand each other, because as anybody who read Eldridge Cleaver's book, he to say that he indulged in a fair bit of misogyny is an understatement, and she was roundly criticized by many of her feminist comrades for that, but she felt that if a formerly incarcerated black man and a former white shopper could together and mold this, it would move people forward. So also in Chicago, we had the Black Panther Party for Self-Determination that was starting to look, and it is cut off here, starting to look at ways of really building a movement beyond beyond just the Black community. And they were looking at groups, what was going on with Join and with the Puerto Rican Young Lords. Oftentimes the mass media would expose guns at their party, but let us also remember about the Serve the People programs, the breakfast programs, the sickle cell anemia programs, all the very peaceful community-based organizing that happened. Well, they were looking for allies, as people who were under the gun were. They A certain amount of the leadership of this chapter had really started to embrace a class politics, and were looking for other working class people to work with and build with. The gentleman at the top, of course, is rest in peace, rest in power, Chairman Fred Hampton. But the person who did a lot of the legwork was my good friend Bob Lee, who's there in the center. He was an organizer who went into white neighborhoods and brown neighborhoods and worked out ways to work with one another, teaching people how to do their own food programs in their community, coming up with strategies to confront police brutality, and forming the original Rainbow Coalition. The Young Lords, I think, are really important because one of the things that they weren't, first of all, that they were a former street gang that went through a transformation to become a political organization. So you don't get any more grassroots than that. My good friend Chacha Jimenez is picked here, and they also, and so how, just many of us are familiar with the narrative surrounding Malcolm X's transformation, but these transformations of people that had done survival organizing is which I'd like to use instead of being a gang member. I like to think of it as survival organizing. Maybe oftentimes, oftentimes with some detrimental effects, but that's what it was. Leaving the illegal acts and the anti-social acts, embracing a revolutionary outlook, and really starting to move their communities in so many ways. It's more this. The Young Lords were more their New York chapter was far more famous, but it started in Chicago with Chacha Jimenez's and others' work. Joanna Fernandez's new book, The Young Lords, is smashingly good, and I recommend people taking a look at it. So out of the Join comes the Young Patriots organization that we saw. The Young Patriots organization, tried to implement organizing models that could break through the haze of racism in Southern descended white folks. So it was not uncommon to see a Confederate flag on their uniform right next to a Free Huey Newton or a Black Power, I support Black Power button. They took much inspiration from the Black Panther Party, implementing survival programs within the poor white community, and doing very, very conscious work to try to encourage people to break from racism and to go a different way. This is what all of these groups are doing, is something that's very, very different than the organizing that was received, the model that was received by, say, Saul Alinsky or even some of the unions, where it's just about bread and butter, the pocketbooks. They're like, yeah, we'll go after that landlord. We'll lead that rent strike. We'll get immediate gains for our people, but they're seeing the social change that's happening underneath the material changes being just as important. As spoiler alert, the Young Patriots organization, near the end of their life as an organization, they actually have resurrected in the past few years, and that's very positive out of Alabama. They left they jettisoned using the Confederate flag as a way of recruiting and getting the ear of Southerners, because it would attract people's eye, but then you would constantly have to explain, no, we're using this, but we're we're not racist. We're just trying to reach people where they're at. So they had to have that conversation so many times. They're like, no, it's not worth it. It's highly divisive. It's highly hurtful, and it's counterproductive. But I think it's really important to understand where it was coming from. Was a point of trying to reach people where they were at, and a lot of folks where they were at was definitely invested in many of the old vestiges of Southern politics. They had a slogan in one of their newspapers that said, "The South will rise again, dot, 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 this time in solidarity with our black, brown, red, yellow brothers and sisters." So very influenced by nationalism in some respects. Uh, I won't get into all this, but they definitely, after a split, some folks went, some folks went national and tried to build chapters in Eugene, Oregon, in Texas, all over the place. Of course, largely thanks to COINTELPRO, a lot of these projects were absolutely dismantled. Another group that comes out of this was Rising Up Angry, that tried to use greaser culture to reach working class youth, especially youth coming out of the service or considering going in. They had a wonderful newspaper. I think it actually stands up as one of the best progressive newspapers ever. Soon to be digitalized on Freedom Archives there. And their idea was they used working class culture. They weren't afraid of having baseball games and football games. And one of the beautiful things about Rising Up Angry, if I could share a story, is that at one Rising Up Angry veteran, Steve Tappas, related a story to me where one of the white people that they've been doing a lot of work with, a veteran, came into their office and said, "Give me a gun and a baseball bat. I have to go after these ends." And they're like, "Wait a minute, this guy, I thought he had become anti-racist," and turned out that there had been a horrible incident where a black man was unjustly accused of harassing a white woman. We know how that from history, how that can turn out. There's going to be a gang war. That up angry, the respect had made with the greasings, not by going and telling black people how to behave, but appealing to white gays. They were able to make sure that this war didn't happen. So it just never happened because they had done the base work and built the alliances and the trust and shifted people's ideas of what was possible and what was right. A little picture here. I won't go into much, but certainly
James, there's a question about, were most community organizers volunteers, or were they funded and paid somehow?
The groups that I'm talking about at this time, most of them were volunteers. This was largely grassroots. So keep in mind, this was a time very different from our own, when it was really cheap to live in U.S. cities, right? So you could do things like pooling your food stamps, or you could rents were not as we see. It was a lot easier to get casual work and things like that. So that's a good question, actually, because that's very different from today. You see any good questions? I know that I've been talking a bit, and I'm going to wind down in a second. Okay.
Deborah asked a question about the flag, but I think you answered that. She was puzzled as to why these groups would use the Confederate flag. But yeah, Troy, I'm hearing the choppiness of the sound too. I don't know what's going on, and I don't know that we can do anything about it except to be patient with it. It seems to come and go. So sorry about that, everyone. This is part and parcel of the technology, unfortunately.
Well, again, oftentimes the Black Panther Party and groups that were associated with them are seen in a one-dimensional way. This is a picture of this alliance, actually on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, actually appealing for peace and asking people not to burn down community assets and to consider organizing against the real enemies of racism and imperialism. And that kind of scared the heck out of the system, because the system knows how to deal with riots, but they don't necessarily know how to deal with multiracial working class unity in development. So to wind down, I won't read off each one of these things, but these are some of the characteristics of this form of organizing. Again, as you consider what organizing means for you, it doesn't mean that you have to adopt anybody's past model, but it's the responsibility of the organizer to consider past models and to take the parts that work the best for them and to leave what doesn't, right? Take what moves your community into positive action, leave what doesn't. There's a racialized division of labor, and that was important because people did not believe that the old you know the old standard of hoping to unify everybody as a class in one organization, as past left had tried, was possible at that time, but they still recognized the need for unity. Bob Lee always said that Rainbow Coalition was a code word for class struggle. Um, and and I just want to underline the idea of self-interest to solidarity. Meet people where they're at around their economic needs, their immediate needs, but also try to use these opportunities to talk about what we have in common, and then stand up for each other around the stuff that we don't have. So um, and I think that's really important, because I think that today's organizing can either get on like the, hey, we have all of this in common, fantastic, we just need to unite around that. Well, when some people in our hopefully beloved community are much more at risk from COVID or police brutality or healthcare disparities, we also have to address the differences. And it's not a one or other type of thing. And I think one of the strands that explore this organization is that you can do both, right? You can talk about the ceiling and you can talk about the floor. All right, so that's it. I think that it's oftentimes important when we talk about organizing is to use stories like this and many others, because I'm highly suspicious of organizing manuals that just say point 8, point 9, point 10. Let's look at ways that people of goodwill have done it from various traditions, and see what we might want to apply for today. The Rainbow Coalition was one of the most dynamic and powerful examples of that time, and of an experiment of being able to come up with a political force that could undermine racism and build unity as a class. And for every mistake I've made, I think we can absolutely keep that center in our understanding of their project. So hopefully I didn't run on the mouth too long, and I look forward to your questions, comments. Zoom's hard to debate, but normally I would add debate to that on. Well, from my interviews with these folks in readings, this is nothing new. Panthers and all their friends and that grappled with the same questions. We remember that Bobby Seale ran for mayor of Oakland at some point, and so did Chacha Jimenez ran for alderman of Chicago. So personally, I think that our task right now are two. One is that we have to save the earth, right? Because or else all conversations stop. But we also, in order to do that, we have to stop the consolidation of fascism and disorganize, as we talk, disorganized fascism in the United States. So to me, the building dual power, building power beyond the electoral process is absolutely important, because the electoral process will always put an embargo on your deepest aspirations. That is not to say that that should be ignored, because the lesser, you know, the lesser of two evils can make a difference as far as our opportunities to build. The ways that we organize under somebody who will further enable the far right, in the way that we organize around someone who wouldn't even, um, are, there's certainly different opportunities. So I'd like to build a movement that can vote and hit the streets and come up with counter institutions, like we see in Jackson, Mississippi now with Cooperation Jackson, and ways that we could figure out ways that these things don't contradict each other, but actually complement each. Inspired by the abolitionist movement, I went to to Critical Resistance's very first conference in 1999, where the idea of abolishing prisons was being proposed. And we go around the room, we all may have different ideas about prison abolition, good idea, bad idea. But I think that we can all agree that because there's been this national coalition that has been raising questions about the necessity of policing, that we have this space now as conditions evolve or devolve, that we can actually talk about, well, how much policing do we actually need? Do we need all these prisons? And people, it's the idea that of defunding the police, as which has happened in LA, by about $50 million, is actually a possibility. So part of it is building the type of organizations like Critical Resistance has, that has multiple ways of participating. Um, People who may want to take a gigantic role at some point can earn that place, and then people who may, like, what, right now I still want to contribute, but maybe I'm going to be providing childcare at the meetings, and honoring all forms of participation, and making, and making multiple ways of contributing to the organization, and just listening to people when they say that they're being burnt out, and having a way, having the third option between um, burning yourself out and being a martyr, and quitting, having other options there. I think that all the best organizations know exactly what to say to an activist when they're saying, what, I'm I'm totally burnt out, or I'm getting there, because they're not as invested in having the president, vice president, chair, and having to, but they're rotating responsibilities, and being kind with one another. I mean, oftentimes those of us who want to change the world can be absolutely horrible when it comes to treating one another well, and treating one another well, is something that is just good organizing, right? It makes people want to stick around over and over again. Arts and culture, I think, are gigantic. We don't just form our ideas about what's right and wrong um, by economic needs and social justice, but through music, through poetry, through activities that make us feel like human beings. And I think organizations, and have fun. Fun is good. Those are the organizations that are built to last, and the ones that will just say, okay, here's our 5-point program. Now let's everybody martyr themselves and sacrifice their lives, their loves, their relationships, their family, their ability to sit down and binge watch a juicy thing on Netflix that makes them happy. Um, those organizations die. Information and propaganda is really important. So the first thing that we have to do is that we might not own MSNBC, or you know, or Fox News. We definitely don't own Fox News by any stretch of imagination, but we have a responsibility to make sure that the stuff that our organizations put out is the truth, is fact checked, right? Um, because it's and just in fixing things. We live in a culture where any organization is going to retweet something that was wrong, put something in their newsletter that wasn't totally factual, and having a way of dealing with it. I love the good old-fashioned fact check. Those of us who can remember newspapers, remember those things. Remember the errata section where like every day they would say, oh, by the way, we made a mistake, last week, and it was brought to our attention. We can do that just through, that. And I think that it's also political. So that's the responsibility of the action. We don't have to ask for anything, but we have to make sure that we are figuring out ways to infiltrate the media in addition to making our own, right? I am so happy to see Alicia Garza speak truth on the news all the time, even gently pushing back against people that are pretty much on our side on a lot of things, right? But just seeing someone say, no, let's refocus this on police violence, right? I just saw her do that like an art, and having people like that and figuring out ways of making sure that there are reliable movement-based people accessing that space and they're elevated is one way of doing it. But as an old zinester myself, I also just believe in making our own media as much as possible. Dana had a wonderful question. Have you dealt with the need to provide access for people with disabilities as a community organizers? Absolutely. This is, I just believe that every single last organization has to continue, continually have a project in their meetings of figuring out what can we do, what resources do we need to figure out how to make things more inclusive for people, people with disabilities, families, differently languaged human beings, things like that, because we can all put on a piece of paper that we're inclusive and that we hate racism and we hate ableism, but those things are always backed up with some tangential work. It's not separate from the fact that almost all of our organizations are under-resourced and everything like that, but all of our organizations have some sort of resource. Even I'm tutoring myself on how to subtitle Zooms. I'm not there yet. I'm getting there, and that's part of what my union is working on. And oftentimes there's other things that you can do that are just simply easy if you're asking the right questions and listening to your comrades with disabilities, like having something in a building that is that is accessible, preferably first floor. Passing the hat so you can pay people that have the skills to translate through through sign language or into Spanish, paying them because that they've been asked time and time again to give these skills out for free. And also being really doing our own work. If I always like to think of disabilities as like it's the one oppression that 80% of the world will eventually have, right? Eventually most of us will experience some sort of disability in our lives. So the work that we're doing for our comrades to include them now is stuff that's going to benefit us tomorrow, right? And so not putting all of the work on people with disabilities to call us out and identifying these things, certainly listening when they do and doing something about it, but doing our own work, because you don't have to have an advanced degree in disability studies to realize that you don't put meetings on the third floor of an elevator-less building, that you don't simply ask the person with sign language skills to constantly donate her work all the time. But it's an organizational commitment and not an individual one. They're falling flat because they're marketing statements and it's virtue signaling. It's not you're correctly identifying that it really doesn't mean anything for most of these folks. It's trying to say, oh no, we're the good ones. Oh, it's like, well, if you're, as my mentor Malik Rahim would always say, protest without program equals zero. And this is just, this is not even protest. It's just statement after statement after statement. So I don't think that the world of venture capital is going to automatically reform itself. Any part of capital, venture or not, That if organizations are concerned with corporations doing less harm, that you have to organize against them and take them on. Period. If not, just unsubscribe and focus your energy on making your organizations that you contribute to as awesome as possible. Because Chevron and Shell, well, they kill organizers, right? That's what they do. We remember Ken Saro-Wiwa, but we don't. We our side tries to constantly do better than it did on these issues than it did the way before. So I think it's just a matter of where you put your energies into. I like the unsubscribe button quite. To do it is really complicated, and it's nothing that we're going to settle in the time that we have. But doing it is can be really liberating, right? If you have people that are really want to learn from each other, and take the I think that these conversations are an opportunity, and I'm not religious, but quite frankly, it's a blessing because you do it. Even a little bit of progress makes your organization so much more so much more effective, right? And that's what, at the end of the day, that's why we are activists, is because we want to be effective. We want to see a result from our collective actions. So there's a lot of good resources out there around it. I highly recommend for white folks, the Catalyst Project is really wonderful. They've taken a lot of lessons from the work of Ann Braden and Southern Student Organizing Committee back in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, updated them, and just been, they come in, they do these workshops that really aren't just guilt-based, but system-based, but then figuring out ways that individuals and organizations can plug in. I'm really impressed with what they do. So that's one way. But in our union, we have 1,300 members. We're probably going to have 1,100 members if our budget cuts go through, unfortunately. And a lot of our older time folks that have some security are white, and a lot of our newer faculty are people of color. And who gets laid off first, right? Who pays the price first, even though if they come for you in the morning, they'll be back for me at night. So to me, it's just part having these spaces where you deal with the hard stuff. You prepare yourself not to be personally defensive, right? Number one thing, you're going to hear some painful stuff, but knowing that in the end, if it's going to make your work just better, and it's really going to make it better if we're thinking about how we all, instead of a guilt thing, because guilt makes one do stuff. Guilt is painful, so it's natural for a human being who feels pain to try to take a step not to feel that pain, right? But instead of a guilt-based thing, thinking about what do we all need to do to prepare ourselves to be part of a movement, and how can we all be useful and play a role? How can our organizations do that? And then you have these individual choices within that, but you start off with the world that you want to change, and then work backwards. And a lot of anti-racist trainings are really just about oh, where's your invisible backpack of privilege, blah blah blah. It's well, true, we all have invisible backpacks, but it's not the best starting point. It's just it's not. I like to start off with a place well, what do we want to change, and what's the internal change that we have to make as individuals and organizations to be an effective part of it. So privilege is important. So it's important to when you're answering. I'm not going to answer this question. I'm going to I'll give you some hints on how I think it should be answered. Define privilege, because are we talking about the type of privilege that's very real, that is smaller in between working people? Certainly white working people have privilege, but it's not the same as a Warren Buffett type of folks. Look at the, and then, so and I don't like the idea of enlightened self-interest, because I like to move people from self-interest to solidarity, because that's where the enlightenment comes from, is when we get to the solidarity. And but personally, I believe, Warren, that you have to organize all who are willing to be organized, and that's rich, poor, middle, working, anybody. We don't have a lot of time to mess around with this earth. So if you see an opening for reaching out to privileged people, however you define it, go for it, right? I mean, it could be a wonderful form of harm reduction. You could pull an ally in. Maybe they're not willing to do it, but do it collectively as part of a group effort, and not just individually. So it's fine. It's a fine thing to do. Certainly, I'm thinking of the work that I got that Billy Upsky did back in the days of just trying to organize. He called it the cool rich kids movement, because he had never realized that he was a rich kid until he inherited a few $1 million. Like, whoops, wow, I guess I'm part of the upper class here. And he immediately turned around to figuring out how to support grassroots groups of color and organizing other folks to do so in a way that respected the autonomy of the groups that they were supporting. So there, as James Baldwin said, there's a place in the choir for everyone. So God, that's such a good question. I don't think there is one step. I think that all of us can figure out ways to contribute to withdrawing whatever we do that helps make a systems of oppression work, and contributing our energies to things that dismantle these things. One thing, just one step. Obviously, I believe everybody should be in an organization of some sort, right? That's committed to this. Just joining organizations, you're already part of a beautiful one called the Humanists. So you already made that step. I think that there's going to be a lot, and I think we already see this around a lot of division around, and a lot of around violence and nonviolence and vandalism and things like that. And I would just call people's attention to this beautiful essay written well over 150 years ago by Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau, as most humanists would recognize, was highly invested in nonviolence, and he wrote Defense of Captain John Brown, who was definitely a guy who was invested in violence to quite a large extent. And figuring out ways that we can have these debates are important to have, but the ways that we have them are even more important, right? Calling for somebody's release, even if you disagree with the action that they took, and then having conversations between organizations um, around what's effective and how do we reach our goals and how do we keep each other safe. That's the way to do it. After Seattle 1999, you had everybody, oh, black bloc, oh, this, all that, like, oh, you're horrible, oh, you're just a stool of the system, oh, you're just enabling police repression by smashing that window. It's like, well, when we have organizations, we can have these conversations based on strategy and shared goals, not finger pointing. So certainly people who are invested in one model or another should put these things out. But I've been part of this beautiful project called the Howard Zinn Book Fair that happens every year, and we use that space to bring together to bring together people that have vastly different theories of change, right? And have one, we had Katie Lonk, who is from Buddhist Peace Fellowship, in conversation with Ward Churchill, who a Native American activist who definitely believes in armed struggle. And it was amazing, right? We had George Lakey debating Mark Bray around how to confront fascism through fists or through ideas or whatnot. And people came out with an increased amount of respect for one another and an understanding of where people get their ideas and why someone would feel driven to the wall to try really dangerous stuff, and also people would maybe reevaluate old deeply held dogmas, and that's movement security when we can learn to build a beloved community in progress even when we have distinct differences. Um, how can we be most useful to the protest now is show up to and there's different ways of showing up, right? Not all of us feel comfortable in this COVID world as showing up physically, right? But there's still resources that we can give. There's meals, there's childcare that can be provided, things like that. So showing up, always think about a movement in a way of many different ways to participate. Find one that works for your comfort level. Poor People's Campaign, my good buddy Willie Baptist was one of the founders of that. So of course, I think it's wonderful to support them. I think that they've been a real conversation changer there. But how ask the Poor People's Campaign, whether it's your local one or the national one. People are looking for allies, and just a simple email like, "Hey, we're the Humanists. We would like to support you. Tell us how." 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a response. I'm not that familiar with the statement of conscience of refuse fascism, but would like to learn more. Say that one thing is that there's an artificial debate in organizing between organizing to change policies and organizing to help people survive. And I think that we can take a lesson from the Panthers, and they're part of the same thing. Not everybody has to do both. So I consider Meals on Heels to be a wonderful new addition to the community organizing family tree. I'll leave you with an idea that I was really inspired by one of the Patriots members, Chuck Armsbury, who lives in Eastern Washington, which was in many people don't realize that Eastern Washington was largely settled by former Confederate Army people as they left the South during the Civil War. So there's some really deep roots of racism. But Chuck, the way that he continued his work as an anti-racist person is that he had this project where he would bring together white victims of the drug war that had done time around meth and things like that in the rural areas, and black victims of the war on drugs from Seattle, using his old connections with the Panthers. And I got to see one of their sessions where they just exchanged experiences and were like, oh, okay, this is what we have in common, and this is where it's still just the drug war still disproportionately impacts black people and black men in particular, and it was just fantastic. So keep on doing what you're doing, and imagine creative ways of further politicizing it in a collective way. But it sounds like you're absolutely on the right track.